It was a chilly autumn evening in the small rural town of White River, South Dakota. The town had always been quiet, with not much happening except the occasional storm or a local festival. My younger brother Austin and I grew up in a modest countryside home, which was just big enough for our small family. Our mom worked night shifts as a nurse at the local hospital, and our dad lived out of state due to his job, only visiting us a couple of times a month. Most nights when Mom worked, our grandma would stay over to look after us. Our house, while small, was cozy. There were 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a living room, and a kitchen that opened into a spacious dining room. My bedroom was in the middle of the hall, Austin's next to mine, and Mom's room at the very end. Grandma always slept in Mom's room whenever she stayed over. That night, Grandma and I were in the living room. She was watching TV while I played with my Legos. It was a typical evening. Austin had already gone to bed. I wasn't scared of the dark or strange noises. I had never believed in the paranormal. Grandma, on the other hand, kept telling me to quiet down, worried I'd wake up Austin. Finally, it was time for bed, and like always, Grandma kissed me goodnight before heading to bed herself. The night was still, and everything was normal. I remember falling asleep quickly, feeling safe and comfortable in my bed. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I was startled because I usually slept like a rock, barely waking up for anything. But tonight, I heard a creaking noise from outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought Grandma was just going to the bathroom. The house's wooden floors always creaked whenever someone walked down the hall. The creaking didn't stop. It sounded like footsteps moving back and forth in the hallway, as if someone was pacing nervously. Confused, I got out of bed and quietly approached my door, trying to listen. Then, to my horror, I heard something else. A faint voice, barely audible, but definitely there. It wasn't clear what was being said, but I could make out some kind of mumbling, a soft, eerie voice that didn't belong to anyone in the house. My first thought was that Grandma was talking to Austin, maybe checking on him. But something didn't feel right. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly opened the door, just enough to peek out into the hallway. And that's when I saw her. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, just a few feet away, was a woman I had never seen before. She was in her 30s, dressed in a long white dress, her dark hair hanging limply around her face. She wasn't looking at me yet, but the sight of her sent chills down my spine. She leaned against the wall, her face buried in her arms, muttering softly to herself. The words weren't clear, but there was something sinister about the way she whispered, something that made my stomach churn. Suddenly, as if sensing my gaze, she snapped her head around and looked directly at me. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with something dark and malevolent. Her face twisted into an unnatural grin as she stared at me. Panic surged through me, and I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away, shaking uncontrollably, but before I could think of what to do, I heard her footsteps approaching my door. Then came the pounding, violent, forceful bangs against the wood, followed by her voice, shrieking my name. "Alex, open the door! Let me in!" she screamed, her voice filled with rage and desperation. I was terrified. I screamed for my grandma as loudly as I could. The pounding continued, the woman's voice growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in fear. I heard her laugh, a high-pitched, deranged sound that sent shivers down my spine. Then, from the hallway, I heard Grandma's voice. She was shouting at the woman, her tone fierce and protective. "Get the hell out of here!" Grandma yelled. I could hear her approaching, her footsteps quick and determined. "You can't stop me!" the woman screamed back. "I've come to take Alex with me." Hearing those words made my blood run cold. I felt my legs buckle beneath me, my hands trembling as I clung to the bedpost. Why did she want me? Who was she? Grandma was in her 60s, but she was still spry. Without hesitation, she grabbed a baseball bat from the hallway closet and charged at the woman. I heard the scuffle, the sounds of the woman screaming as she was forced to retreat. Finally, the door slammed, and everything went silent. Grandma locked the doors and windows and immediately called the police. When they arrived, they searched the house thoroughly but found nothing. They discovered footprints inside the hallway, but bizarrely, the tracks disappeared once they reached the yard, despite the wet ground outside. It was as if the woman had vanished into thin air. The officers were baffled, but assured us that they would keep an eye on the area. For the next couple of days, we lived in constant fear. Nothing happened for 2 nights, but we couldn't shake the terror that had gripped us. On the 3rd night, the pounding returned, but this time it wasn't just the woman at the door. There were knocks and bangs from all around the house, on the windows, on the walls, and even from within the house itself. The woman's voice echoed through the house, calling my name again and again, demanding that I come to her. This time, my mom was home. She had taken a week off work after the first incident. She and Grandma locked Austin and me in my room while they armed themselves with baseball bats, ready to defend us. Mom couldn't handle it anymore. After another sleepless night of terror, she decided we had to leave. Within a week, we packed up and moved to a different town. Grandma stayed with us, unwilling to let us out of her sight. We never saw the woman in white again, but I've never forgotten her. To this day, I can still hear her voice calling my name in the dead of night, and I often wonder what would have happened if Grandma hadn't been there to protect me that first night. The house in White River was sold soon after we left, but I often wonder if the new owners ever experienced anything strange. Whoever that woman was, whatever she wanted, she wasn't human, and the thought of her still haunts me. I'll never forget her twisted grin, her icy voice, and the way she whispered that she had come to take me with her. It happened 6 years ago when I was about 22, but the experience still sends chills down my spine. Even now, the memory is vivid, etched deep in my mind. It was the 15th of June, and I had the house to myself. My parents were on vacation in Spain, so I had been relishing the quiet time alone. That evening, around 8 p.m., the heat was unbearable. I remember sweating profusely in my tank top and shorts, feeling as if the walls were radiating warmth. To cool down the house, I opened all the windows in the living room and bedroom, hoping the night air would bring some relief. Exhaustion tugged at me, though. I had attended college that morning and played a grueling volleyball match in the afternoon, so my body was screaming for rest. After a quick dinner, I collapsed onto my bed without even realizing it, drifting off almost instantly. I woke up sometime around 4 a.m. to the distant rumble of thunder and a cool breeze hitting my face. The intense heat from earlier had subsided, replaced by a growing chill as the storm loomed closer. My curtains flapped wildly in the wind, and I could hear the shutters banging against the windows. Groggily, I reached for the bedside lamp, but it wouldn't turn on. Great, a power outage, I muttered to myself. I checked the plug, but it was fine. My phone's flashlight had to do the trick, so I shined it around the room, half blinded by sleep. Outside, the sky was a menacing, swirling mass of black clouds. The streetlights were out, confirming my suspicion that there was a blackout in the neighborhood. The wind was howling now, whistling through the trees and shaking the windows. The storm was intensifying, and I knew I had to shut the windows before the rain hit. Still drowsy, I stumbled down the hallway, flashlight in hand, to close the windows. As I reached the living room, I noticed something odd. The mosquito net on one of the windows was lifted. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I hadn't left it like that. The logical part of me tried to rationalize it. The wind, I told myself, maybe it was strong enough to push the net up, but something about it felt off. Feeling uneasy, I glanced around the living room, scanning it with the flashlight. The furniture was undisturbed, nothing seemed out of place. Maybe I was being paranoid. I had checked everything, and there was no reason to suspect anything wrong. After all, I was just exhausted, probably imagining things. I shut the windows, telling myself to relax and go back to bed. But as I turned to leave the living room, something caught my eye. At the top of the stairs leading to the attic, a bright flash of light illuminated the room. For a second, I dismissed it as lightning. After all, a storm was brewing. But then, something felt off. The light was too vivid, too concentrated, and there had been no sound of thunder. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. That wasn't lightning. Could it have been a flashlight? My stomach churned with fear as the realization dawned on me. Someone could be in the house. I stood there frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Had they heard me closing the windows? Were they armed? Did they just want to rob the place, or was something more sinister at play? I knew I had to act fast. My parents weren't around to help, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Just then, the sound of a doorknob turning caught my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight towards the living room entrance. Through the glass-paneled door, I saw the silhouette of a man standing just outside the front door. There was someone else with him, his accomplice, no doubt. A surge of panic shot through me. I felt utterly powerless. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I knew I had to stay calm. Moving as quietly as possible, I tiptoed towards the basement stairs, my phone still lighting my way. The basement connected directly to the garage, and I figured it would be my best escape route. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, explaining what was happening. The operator tried to reassure me, telling me to stay calm and that the police were on their way. She advised me to lock myself in a safe room until help arrived. I was about to respond when the call dropped. Panic surged through me. I glanced at my phone, realizing I had lost signal in the basement. To make things worse, my battery was almost dead. I made my way to the garage, my gut telling me I was being watched. The feeling was so strong that I couldn't shake it. When I turned my flashlight towards my car, my blood ran cold. Sitting in the back seat, staring at me through the rearview mirror, was a man. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he was looking straight through me. His yellow grin stretched unnaturally across his face, and he waved at me slowly, as if mocking my fear. I froze, terror paralyzing my body. Before I could react, my phone battery died, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I heard the car door creak open. My body moved on instinct. I bolted for the garage door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. As I heard footsteps behind me, I finally managed to unlock it and sprinted outside into the storm. By now, the rain was pouring down in sheets, and the wind howled even louder. I ran to my neighbor's house, screaming for help. My clothes were soaked, and I could barely catch my breath as I pounded on their door. They opened up, startled by my frantic state, and I quickly explained what had happened. In the distance, I heard sirens. Finally, the police were arriving. 2 patrol cars sped down the street, and I ran towards them, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. I told the officers everything, still trembling from the ordeal. The police wasted no time. 4 of them entered the house with guns drawn, while another stayed behind to take my statement. I waited anxiously, praying they would find the intruders. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. The house was empty. The men were gone. They had taken some valuable antiques, but thankfully, that was the extent of the damage. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind sent me into a state of panic. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering how close I had come to something far worse. The next morning, I found something that chilled me to my core. On the edge of my bed, there was a small piece of paper. Written on it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Bye-bye, beauty. You look cute when you sleep." My heart stopped. They had been in my room while I slept. I immediately handed the note to the police, and the investigation took a sharp turn. The officers carefully placed the slip of paper into an evidence bag and assured me they would dust it for fingerprints. The fact that the intruders had been bold enough to enter my bedroom while I slept made my skin crawl. I could barely stand still as the police combed through my home for more clues, searching every inch of the house for anything the men might have left behind. My sense of safety had been completely shattered. The next day, the forensics team called with news. They had found clear fingerprints on the note. One of the officers explained that the prints matched those of a known career criminal, someone with a long rap sheet for burglary and home invasion. He was part of a trio of thieves who had been terrorizing the surrounding neighborhoods for months, targeting homes late at night when the owners were either away or fast asleep. It became clear that my home wasn't chosen at random. It was a deliberate, well-planned break-in. The police, now knowing who they were dealing with, devised a plan to catch the criminals once and for all. They didn't want to risk spooking them or having them slip through their fingers again. So they proposed a trap, one that would lure the trio back to my neighborhood, where they would be waiting. For the next week, my house remained under close surveillance. Plainclothes officers were stationed in cars parked discreetly around the block, while others kept watch from nearby houses. The police even encouraged me to leave my windows slightly ajar, just as they had been the night of the break-in, to make it seem like I was still a vulnerable target. It felt like bait, but I trusted the police. They assured me that they had everything under control. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong. Every night, I slept fitfully, waking up at every creak and gust of wind. What if they didn't come back? What if they decided to target someone else? Worse, what if they knew the police were waiting and tried to retaliate? The tension was unbearable. Finally, on the 7th night, it happened. Just after midnight, one of the officers on stakeout radioed in. They had spotted a dark van creeping down the street with its headlights off. It pulled to a stop a few houses away from mine. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched from the safe house next door, where the police had relocated me for the night. They whispered updates to me as the events unfolded. 3 figures emerged from the van, moving swiftly and quietly. They wore dark hoodies and gloves, and their faces were partially obscured by scarves. As they approached my house, one of them took out a flashlight, flicking it on and off quickly, as if signaling to the others. They were clearly professionals. They worked with a terrifying precision, like predators stalking their prey. The police were ready. They let the intruders get close, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One of the men climbed the front steps of my house, while the other 2 circled around to the backyard, just as they had done during the first break-in. The officer in charge of the operation, who was monitoring the scene from a nearby surveillance van, gave the signal. In an instant, the quiet night erupted into chaos. Floodlights flicked on, illuminating the house and the surrounding area. Officers burst from their hiding spots, shouting commands for the intruders to freeze. Startled, the men bolted in different directions, trying to flee. One ran towards the backyard fence, scrambling to climb over it, while another darted down the side of the house, heading for the street. The third man, the one who had been closest to the front door, hesitated for a split second, realizing he was trapped. He turned to run, but it was too late. 2 officers tackled him to the ground, pinning him down as he struggled and cursed. The others weren't so lucky either. The man trying to scale the fence was brought down by an officer who had been stationed on the other side, waiting for just such an escape attempt. He fought back, kicking and swinging his arms wildly, but within moments, the officer had him handcuffed and subdued. The final intruder, the one who had fled towards the street, made it to the sidewalk and sprinted towards the van. He was fast, faster than the officers chasing him, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually get away. But just as he reached the van, tires screeched, and 2 patrol cars blocked his path. Realizing he had no way out, he raised his hands in surrender, collapsing to his knees as the officers moved in to arrest him. It was over. The trio had been caught. I watched the entire thing unfold from the safe house, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone. I couldn't believe it was finally happening. The men who had terrorized me, who had invaded my home, left that horrifying note, and shattered my sense of security, were now in police custody. Later that night, after the adrenaline had worn off and the police had processed the scene, they brought me to the station to formally identify the intruders. I stood behind a one-way mirror, watching as the 3 men sat in handcuffs, their faces contorted with anger and frustration. They weren't so terrifying now, sitting there powerless, awaiting their fate. The leader of the group, the man whose fingerprints had been found on the note, glared at the officers, defiant until the very end. But there was nothing he could do now. The police had them dead to rights. Fingerprints, the stolen items from my house, and now the botched break-in, all captured on video. They were charged with multiple counts of burglary, home invasion, and possession of stolen property. For me, the nightmare was finally over. But even after they were sentenced and sent to prison, the memory of that night lingered. The feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been inside my home while I slept, haunted me for months. I installed new locks, got a security system, and moved to a different neighborhood, hoping to leave the fear behind. Yet, even now, 6 years later, I still catch myself checking the windows before bed, making sure every door is locked, every curtain drawn. I still get chills when I hear a creak in the house late at night, and I can't shake the sense that somewhere out there, someone might be watching. Someone might be watching. Night of Terror. It was a cool autumn evening, and the sprawling mansion of the Fernandez family sat eerily still on the edge of their quiet, affluent neighborhood in St. Moritz, Switzerland. High walls surrounded the house, and a lone security guard, Jonas, patrolled the gates. Inside, 17-year-old Marissa Fernandez and her 12-year-old brother, Adrian, were spending the night with their 60-year-old aunt, Claudette, while their parents were away on a vacation in the Maldives. The house, usually filled with laughter and voices, now felt silent and foreboding. Marissa was in her room on the second floor, video chatting with a friend, while Adrian played video games in the living room downstairs. Aunt Claudette, who had come to keep an eye on the kids, was quietly knitting on the couch beside him, occasionally glancing at the television. Jonas, outside the gates, had just finished a quick round of checks when something strange caught his attention. 3 men approached the front gate, all dressed in black from head to toe. Their faces were obscured by ski masks, and they moved with precision, clearly having scoped out the house beforehand. Jonas was about to raise the alarm when one of the men pulled out a stun gun. Before Jonas could react, the jolt hit him. His body convulsed, and he collapsed onto the gravel, unable to scream. They quickly gagged him, tied him up, and dragged him behind a bush, hidden from view. The men, one tall and broad, the second average in height but with a calculating look in his eyes, and the third stocky with a muscular build, were prepared. They picked the gate's lock with expertise and crept through the garden silently. The plan was simple: kidnap Adrian, demand a ransom, and disappear. The Fernandez family was one of the wealthiest in the country, and the kidnappers knew their demands would be met. Inside, Marissa had finished her call and was lying on her bed, scrolling through social media. The house was quiet, save for the soft clinking of Aunt Claudette's knitting needles and the distant sounds of Adrian's video game downstairs. Marissa sighed, feeling an odd sense of unease. Maybe it was the vast emptiness of the house, or maybe it was just her nerves, but something felt wrong. She dismissed the feeling and continued scrolling. The intruders moved toward the house with silent precision. They found a side door that led to the kitchen, and with a small crowbar, they pried it open. The door swung inward, and the men slipped inside like shadows. Once inside, they crouched, moving stealthily through the darkened house. Marissa, upstairs, suddenly heard a faint creak. It was barely audible, but enough to make her sit up. Her heart skipped a beat, and she strained to hear more. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then another creak, followed by a soft shuffle. Someone was inside the house. She quickly swung her legs off the bed and crept to her door, opening it slightly. From the upstairs hallway, she could hear faint voices coming from downstairs, low, hushed tones. Her pulse quickened. She tiptoed to the top of the staircase and glanced down. Through the dim light filtering in from the windows, she could see 3 men moving through the house, one of them whispering harshly to the others. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. She quickly ducked back into the shadows, her mind racing. She needed to warn Aunt Claudette and Adrian. The intruders were in the house, and from the way they moved, they weren't here to rob them. They were here for something else, something far worse. She rushed back to her room and grabbed her phone, dialing Aunt Claudette's number. The phone rang, and downstairs, Aunt Claudette picked it up. "Marissa, what is it?" "Aunt Claudette," Marissa whispered urgently. "There are men in the house, 3 of them. They're downstairs." Aunt Claudette froze, her knitting slipping from her hands. She glanced at Adrian, who was still engrossed in his game, oblivious to the danger. "Stay calm, Marissa," she whispered back. "I'll get Adrian. We'll find a place to hide. Don't come down." Aunt Claudette stood up quietly and crossed the room to Adrian, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Adrian, honey," she said softly, "pause your game. We need to go upstairs now." Adrian frowned. "Why? What's going on?" "There's no time to explain. Just trust me, she urged, her voice trembling slightly. Come on. Reluctantly, Adrian followed her, sensing the urgency in her voice. They crept up the stairs, where Marissa was waiting, her face pale with fear. What are we going to do? Adrian whispered, his eyes wide. Marissa motioned for them to follow her into her bedroom. We need to hide and figure out a way to call for help, she said, locking the door behind them. The intruders, I think they're after Adrian. I overheard them talking. Aunt Claudette's face went pale. They want to kidnap him, she muttered, for ransom. We need to stay quiet, Marissa said, looking around the room for a hiding spot. We can't let them find us. They quickly hid Adrian under the bed, while Aunt Claudette and Marissa positioned themselves behind the large wardrobe. They could hear the intruders moving through the house, their footsteps getting louder as they neared the stairs. One of the men, the stocky one, growled in a low voice, "Find the boy. The faster we get him, the faster we're out of here." The sound of heavy boots echoed up the stairs as the men approached. Marissa's heart pounded so loudly she feared it would give them away. She held her breath, gripping Aunt Claudette's hand tightly as the door handle rattled. "Ah, ah." The door creaked open, and the intruders stepped inside. Marissa peeked through the narrow gap between the wardrobe and the wall, watching as the men scanned the room. The tall one glanced under the bed, but missed seeing Adrian, who was curled up tightly in the shadows. "We'll split up," the broad man said. "Check every room." They left the room, and Marissa exhaled a shaky breath. "We need to get out," she whispered. "If we stay here, they'll find us eventually." Aunt Claudette nodded. "There's a window that leads to the roof in the attic," she said. "We can try to escape that way." Quietly, they helped Adrian out from under the bed and moved toward the attic, tiptoeing past the rooms as the intruders searched the house. When they reached the attic, Marissa unlocked the small window, and they climbed out onto the sloped roof. The wind howled, and the night air chilled them to the bone, but they had no choice. They had to escape. Just as they started to climb down the roof, the tall intruder spotted them. "They're on the roof," he shouted, alerting the others. A chase ensued. The intruders scrambled outside, trying to follow them. Marissa led the way down, helping Adrian and Aunt Claudette. They ran toward the neighbor's house, but the stocky intruder was gaining on them fast. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The neighbors, having seen the commotion, had called the police. Blue and red lights flashed, and within moments, several police cars surrounded the house. The intruders, caught off guard, tried to flee, but the police were quick to act. "Freeze!" shouted one of the officers, gun drawn. The intruders attempted to scatter, but it was too late. The police tackled them to the ground and handcuffed them. Marissa, Adrian, and Aunt Claudette watched from the neighbor's driveway, their hearts still pounding from the terror. The leader of the intruders, the tall man, cursed under his breath as he was dragged into a squad car. "You got lucky, kid," he spat at Adrian, "but we'll be back." The officer shook his head. "Not anytime soon," he said, slamming the door. As the police took the criminals away, Marissa finally exhaled in relief. She hugged Adrian tightly, grateful that they were safe. Aunt Claudette wiped a tear from her eye, her hands still trembling from the ordeal. That night, as the police took their statements, Marissa realized how close they had come to disaster. The intruders' plan had failed, but the memory of their cold, calculated intent would stay with her forever. Even though they were safe now, the shadow of that night lingered, a reminder that sometimes danger lurks where you least expect it. The neighbors, who had come to their rescue, comforted the shaken family. And while the ordeal was finally over, Marissa, Adrian, and Aunt Claudette knew they would never forget the night they fought for their lives. Being a police officer in South Dakota has always been a steady job for me. I started my career at 27, and while it can be grueling at times, it's usually calm work. My county sees its share of minor disturbances, the occasional theft, and sometimes more serious cases, but those are rare. I'd been on every possible shift, and the night shift had its oddities, without a doubt. One night, during a routine night shift, I encountered something that would make my hair stand on end, something I would never forget. It was around 2 a.m., and I was cruising down a quiet road, blanketed by darkness, with only woods on both sides and no streetlights. As I drove, I saw the glow of taillights sitting in the grass off the right side of the road. Getting closer, I realized the car's driver's side door was wide open. Assuming someone might need assistance, I pulled onto the grass, slowing down and preparing to step out. Just then, a figure appeared by the driver's door, pausing for a split second before turning and dashing into the woods. I immediately shouted, "Stop! Police!" But the figure disappeared into the shadows. I radioed in a code for a suspicious person and vehicle and got out with my flashlight, my hand instinctively hovering over my holstered gun. Approaching the car, I felt something was off. There was a foul odor coming from inside, like the stench of something rotting. I called out again, hoping someone might respond, but the forest remained silent. Steeling myself, I glanced inside the car. The interior was a mess, with bloodied tissues and paper towels scattered across the passenger seat and back row. Each paper was soaked through, a dark red that looked old but still wet. My gut churned, and I radioed for backup, knowing this wasn't just a routine stop. Just then, I heard footsteps in the woods. I spun around, flashing my light into the trees, yelling, "Come out! I can help you!" A low, guttural voice called back from the shadows, but I couldn't make out the words. "Are you hurt?" I shouted, stepping closer, now ready to draw my weapon. The silence that followed was chilling. Whoever it was didn't sound like someone injured or scared. They sounded calm, dangerous. I decided to retreat to the car and request additional units. Turning back to the vehicle, I started searching the rear area for more clues, and that's when I found it. A blood-soaked, heavy bundle of paper towels in the back seat. Carefully, I unwrapped it with gloved hands, and my stomach turned as I saw a severed hand, crimson and fresh, still bleeding. For a moment, I just stared, frozen in horror. I immediately radioed in for backup, reporting a possible homicide. I turned on my cruiser's lights, flashing red and blue, hoping it would help the other officers spot my location. The situation had escalated, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. Within minutes, backup arrived, and soon, officers spread out to comb through the woods. We couldn't afford to let this person escape. The canine unit was called in to track down the individual who had run into the woods, and for hours, we combed through the dense forest, but our search turned up empty. The car, as we later discovered, had been reported stolen from a nearby town, though the owner claimed no knowledge of who might have taken it. We returned to the station, evidence in tow, but the leads quickly dried up. Fingerprints lifted from the steering wheel and door handles didn't match anyone in the system. DNA testing on the severed hand yielded no hits either. It was as if the suspect and the victim, whoever they were, didn't exist. Days passed, and the case became the talk of the town. I was haunted by the memory of that night, the sight of the severed hand, and the shadowy figure who'd slipped away. But just as the case was slipping into the unsolved file, we got a break. A man named Carl from a neighboring town reported suspicious activity at his farmhouse. He'd seen a stranger sneaking around his property late at night, and his description matched the figure I'd seen that night. We sprang into action, assembling a team to investigate the farmhouse. It was isolated, tucked into the outskirts of town, and surrounded by fields that provided plenty of hiding spots. We arrived under the cover of darkness, silently encircling the house. As we approached, a light flickered in one of the windows. Someone was definitely there. A plan was quickly devised. 2 officers would move in from the front, while I and a few others would cover the back exits, hoping to corner the intruder. I had a feeling this was the person responsible for the scene I'd stumbled upon days earlier, and I wasn't about to let him slip through our fingers again. We closed in, and just as we prepared to enter, a figure bolted from a side door, dashing toward the woods. "Stop! Police!" I shouted, adrenaline surging as we took off after him. The chase was grueling, with the figure weaving through trees and sprinting across uneven ground, but we were gaining on him. The suspect stumbled, giving me the chance to close the distance. Lunging forward, I tackled him to the ground. He thrashed, but I managed to secure his hands, and with the help of another officer, we got him in cuffs. His face was gaunt, and his eyes held a strange, unsettling calmness as he stared back at us. Back at the station, under questioning, he was silent at first, but gradually, he began to talk. He confessed that he'd stolen the car to evade the police, but had dumped it when he noticed me approaching. As for the severed hand, he wouldn't say much, only that it was a mistake, and something he hadn't meant to leave behind. It turned out he had a record of violent offenses, mostly assaults, but nothing quite as brutal as this. In the end, DNA evidence linked him to a string of assaults and thefts across several counties. The hand, though unidentified, was suspected to be from a victim yet to be reported missing, leaving a haunting mystery of its own. But with his arrest, the string of violent crimes that had plagued nearby towns finally ceased. He was sentenced to prison, ensuring he wouldn't harm anyone again. As the months passed, the memory of that night still lingered with me. I would often recall the stillness of the woods, the silence after his strange voice called out from the trees, and the grisly evidence left behind. But I took solace in knowing that justice had been served, and I had played my part in preventing further harm. It was a reminder of the darkness that sometimes lurks in the quietest places and the resilience needed to face it head-on. Story number 2. It was late, well past midnight, when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice had an edge of urgency as they relayed the report of a possible break-in. A young woman had called in, her voice shaken and laced with fear. She had come home to find one of her downstairs windows broken. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Moments later, she heard footsteps echoing from downstairs, and shortly after that, her call had cut off unexpectedly. Attempts to call her back were futile. She wasn't picking up. My gut told me this was more than just a routine check. I arrived at the house, a modest 2-story, with soft yellow lights still illuminating some of the rooms. I approached the front door, knocking firmly, hoping the woman would come to the door and explain. But there was only silence. After a few minutes, I knocked again, louder, this time ringing the doorbell for good measure. Still no response. There was an uneasy stillness surrounding the house, an unsettling quiet that put me on edge. I decided to circle the perimeter. Sure enough, I found a window on the side of the house shattered inward, large enough for someone to have crawled through. My pulse quickened as I looked through the window and called out, "Police! Is anyone there?" The only response was the faint creak of the house settling. I radioed in to dispatch, notifying them of the broken window and that the house appeared quiet, but I couldn't shake the worry that something was very wrong. I relayed my intent to enter and slipped through the window, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound of crunching glass beneath my boots seemed to echo as I stepped inside, raising my gun as I moved slowly through the kitchen. The house was eerily silent, yet I could feel a tension hanging in the air. I called out, "Ma'am, are you here? It's the police." My voice seemed to bounce off the walls. I paused to listen but heard nothing, so I decided to head upstairs, where the woman had indicated she heard the sounds. The staircase groaned softly under my weight, each step feeling like an amplified thud in the otherwise silent house. "Ma'am, are you there?" I called out, feeling the tension intensify. Finally, a soft, trembling voice responded from one of the bedrooms upstairs. I followed the sound, my heart racing as I stepped into the room. There she was, sitting up in bed, her face half lit by the pale glow of moonlight streaming through the window. She looked visibly shaken, her hands clutched tightly around the blanket pulled up to her chest. Her eyes were wide, and a glimmer of fear flashed across her face when she looked at me. I asked if she was okay, and she nodded, but I could see she was far from it. I noticed her eyes darting around the room nervously, her voice quivering as she whispered, There's no one here." The odd phrasing made my instincts kick in. I glanced toward the closet, and she subtly shook her head. Then, with a slight shift in her gaze, she directed my attention to the space under the bed. My stomach dropped as I realized what was going on. Thinking fast, I needed a way to get her safely out of the room without alarming whoever was hiding under the bed. I told her calmly, "Ma'am, I'll need you to sign this report, just so we have a record of my visit." She nodded, getting up from the bed slowly, her every movement tense and deliberate. As she reached me, I placed my hand on her shoulder and quickly guided her out of the bedroom, whispering for her to stay downstairs and out of sight. Turning back to the room, I drew my gun and aimed it toward the bed. "This is the police. Come out from under the bed with your hands visible and no sudden moves." My voice was steady, but the tension in the room was palpable. After a moment, there was a shuffling sound, and then I saw hands emerge first, followed by a man in dark clothing. He slowly crawled out, his expression void of emotion, as he dropped a small handgun onto the floor and stood up with his hands raised. I held him at gunpoint as I radioed in that I had apprehended the intruder. By the time my backup arrived, the woman was sitting downstairs, visibly shaken but unharmed. As the officers led the man out to the squad car, she explained why she had hung up and ignored the callback attempts. She'd realized the intruder was already inside, and with him threatening her at gunpoint, she couldn't risk making noise or trying to escape. The arrest seemed to close the case neatly, but as I walked out of the house to brief the arriving officers, something caught my attention. A flicker of movement from the shadows near the back of the property. My flashlight revealed nothing, but a lingering suspicion gnawed at me. I quickly alerted the other officers and told them to keep an eye on the perimeter while I took another look inside. Heading back into the house, I double-checked the rooms upstairs, scanning every corner, closet, and dark shadow. I was about to call it clear when I heard a creak from the basement door, a place none of us had thought to search earlier. My heart pounded as I crept down the narrow staircase, the air growing cooler with each step. The basement was cloaked in darkness, only partially illuminated by my flashlight beam. Then, in the far corner, I saw a figure crouching low, almost blending into the shadows. He was dressed similarly to the first intruder, his face contorted in a menacing sneer. It hit me. This was his partner, likely lying in wait to strike once he thought the coast was clear. As soon as my flashlight hit him, he lunged forward, brandishing a knife, his eyes flashing with rage. I yelled for him to stop, but he charged, forcing me to make a split-second decision. I dodged his initial thrust and with a swift move, managed to knock the knife from his hand and subdue him. Within moments, he was cuffed and breathing heavily on the cold basement floor, a look of defiance still in his eyes. He glared up at me, muttering something about how we'd taken his friend, how he'd planned to finish what they started. It was chilling, knowing how close he'd come to exacting his revenge on the young woman upstairs. By the time the backup officers joined me in the basement, the second man had already been restrained and escorted outside. The woman was understandably shaken when I informed her of the second intruder, but she expressed immense relief that both of them were finally gone. As we cleared the scene and took the men to the station, I couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened had we not found the second man lurking in the basement, waiting for his moment. After the arrests, both intruders were charged with breaking and entering, possession of an illegal firearm, and intent to harm. It was later revealed that they had planned the break-in to intimidate and terrorize the woman for reasons that still remained unclear. All we knew for certain was that the woman's intuition had likely saved her life that night, and a single phone call had thwarted a far more sinister plan. That night, as I finally headed home, I couldn't help but feel grateful that we'd managed to prevent a tragedy. But the experience left me with a lingering unease, an unsettling reminder that sometimes even the quietest nights can hold the darkest dangers. My best friend Dan has been a night shift cop for almost a decade in our city. He and his partner Ray are veterans from the Army, both with calm, level-headed demeanors perfect for policing. Their shifts are usually quiet, but every now and then they get the kind of call that sets them on edge. And on that particular night, they received one such call. It was close to 2 a.m. when they got a report from a landlord at an apartment complex called Hollow Oaks, a place notorious for strange incidents. The landlord, a weary old man named Mr. Garrison, had called to complain about a tenant named Tom causing trouble. Apparently, Tom, a quiet loner in his mid-30s, had suddenly flooded his entire apartment. Dan and Ray had been called out to Hollow Oaks before, but this time, things felt different. When they arrived, they found the tenants gathered on the lawn outside, wrapped in blankets and whispering among themselves. Some of them looked away as Dan and Ray walked up, as if afraid to meet their eyes. Mr. Garrison hurried over, visibly flustered, explaining in rapid bursts that Tom had turned on every faucet in his apartment, the sink, shower, even the toilet, and an outside hose. Water was pouring from the windows, seeping down the walls, and forming dark stains on the bricks below. Dan exchanged a glance with Ray, feeling a sense of unease he couldn't quite place. He'd seen plenty of odd things on his shifts, but the sight of the gathered tenants, the rippling water, and Mr. Garrison's panicked face created an eerie atmosphere. Together, they moved toward the stairwell leading up to Tom's apartment. The building itself was old, with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways. As they climbed, they could hear the unmistakable sound of rushing water, louder with each step. A trickle of water ran down the stairs, splashing around their boots as they climbed. It was as if the building itself were leaking, its structure straining under the pressure. When they reached Tom's apartment, they knocked and called his name, but there was no answer. After waiting for several moments, Ray motioned to the door, and they forced it open. The smell of dampness hit them immediately, mingling with an unsettling, earthy odor. Water was pooling on the floor, flooding nearly every inch of the apartment. Tom was standing in the middle of his kitchen, his back to them, shaking violently. Dan stepped forward, speaking gently. "Tom, are you all right?" At first, there was no response. Then, Tom's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper at first. "They're in the walls." Dan frowned, not sure he'd heard correctly. He took a step closer, but Tom's words grew louder and more desperate. "They're in the walls, watching me, always watching." Ray had already moved deeper into the apartment, trying to shut off the faucets. Dan kept his focus on Tom, who seemed terrified, his eyes darting to the walls as though something might break through at any moment. Tom's face was pale, his hair damp from the mist in the air, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "What do you mean, Tom? Who's in the walls?" Dan asked, hoping to calm him down. Tom's gaze snapped back to Dan, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't respond directly, just kept muttering, "They're there, watching, waiting." Ray's voice came from the bedroom, sounding tense. "Dan, you might want to see this." Leaving Tom in the kitchen, Dan made his way down the short hallway, where he found Ray standing before a wall in the bedroom. His flashlight was aimed at a thin, almost invisible line running across the wall, forming the outline of a door. Ray turned to Dan, his face tight with worry. "Look at this," Ray murmured, tapping his flashlight along the line. "It's a hidden door, but it doesn't look like it's part of the original building structure." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. The outline was just barely visible, but now that Ray had pointed it out, he could clearly see the door-shaped indentation. The idea that there might be something or someone behind it was unnerving. They exchanged a look, both feeling the weight of what they might be about to uncover. With a nod, Ray reached out and tugged at the edge of the wall. It took a bit of force, but finally, a panel gave way, swinging open to reveal a dark, narrow crawl space. Dan's flashlight beam sliced through the shadows, landing on three figures crouched together in the cramped space. They were huddled so close that they seemed almost fused together, their bodies pressed tightly in the narrow area. Their faces were painted in strange, abstract patterns, their eyes reflecting the flashlight's glare. The figures sat motionless, their expressions blank, and for a long moment, no one moved. Dan and Ray's instincts kicked in, and they drew their guns, their voices sharp as they ordered the strangers to exit. Slowly, with robotic movements, the figures unfolded themselves from the crawl space and stepped into the room. Two men and a woman, each with a dazed look in their eyes, as if they were under some kind of trance. Tom, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway, his face contorted in fear. As the strangers were led out of the apartment, he began to cry, muttering, "They were in my walls. I could hear them, whispering things to me at night." By the time they reached the front lawn, backup had arrived. Officers escorted the three intruders to waiting patrol cars, while others tried to calm Tom, who was still mumbling incoherently. Dan and Ray exchanged a look, shaken by the discovery. They knew this case would haunt them. Over the next few days, they uncovered more details about the intruders. The three people were members of an obscure cult operating out of a shack in the woods outside the city. Known for their disturbing rituals, they targeted vulnerable individuals, slipping into their homes and hiding within the walls, waiting until their victims' minds frayed under the strain of constant surveillance and harassment. Tom, as it turned out, had been their latest target. The cult had been watching him for weeks, whispering through the walls, moving silently in the dark, and feeding on his paranoia. They'd slipped into his life undetected, driving him to the brink of madness, hoping to recruit him by breaking down his mind. Dan couldn't shake the memory of those painted faces staring out from the crawlspace. Even with the case seemingly closed, he had trouble sleeping. Images of faces hidden within walls haunted his thoughts, and he couldn't stop wondering, how many others had they done this to? How many other hidden doors and crawlspaces existed, concealing horrors beyond the walls? A few weeks passed, and the story of Tom and the cult members faded from local gossip, replaced by other, more ordinary news. But then, one quiet evening, Ray called Dan in the middle of the night. His voice was tense, each word laced with a hint of dread. "Dan, I just got another call," Ray said, his voice barely a whisper. "Another building, another tenant. They're hearing things from inside the walls." Dan felt his blood run cold. They had believed the cult members were caught, the nightmare over. But as he sat in silence, gripping the phone tightly, he realized that the horror of Hollow Oaks was far from over. There was something more sinister at play, something they hadn't fully understood. As he and Ray drove toward the new location, the streets seemed darker, the buildings towering over them like silent witnesses. Dan's mind raced, wondering what they would find this time. Would they uncover more strangers, lurking within hidden rooms and crawl spaces? Or was this just the beginning of something even more twisted? When they arrived, the scene was eerily familiar. Tenants gathered in the dark, huddled in silence, casting anxious glances toward the building. The landlord, a woman with wide, fearful eyes, pointed them up the stairwell, whispering that she could hear something moving within the walls. With each step, Dan felt a growing sense of dread. The faint sound of scratching met his ears, as though something or someone was just beyond the walls, hidden from sight but close enough to be heard. He and Ray exchanged a look, both knowing that this call might be their most dangerous yet. And as they approached the apartment, the sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Dan's heart raced, his grip tightening on his flashlight. This time, they weren't just investigating a disturbance. They were diving into a nightmare, one that might never truly end. When they reached the apartment door, Dan paused, taking a deep breath. He glanced back at Ray, who nodded in silent understanding. Whatever waited for them inside, they would face it together. But as they stepped inside and the door creaked shut behind them, Dan had the uneasy feeling that they might not be alone, that the walls themselves were watching, waiting for their next victim. Hello, everyone. I'm Officer Ethan Doyle, and my partner for the night, Officer Mia Turner, and I were working the night shift, something we'd both done countless times. Usually, our shifts are uneventful, handling a loud neighbor here, a minor bar brawl there, or the occasional speeding car. But tonight was different. Around midnight, we received a call over the radio. Dispatch reported a suspected break-in at the town morgue. I raised an eyebrow and glanced at Mia. "Did I hear that right?" I muttered. "A break-in at the morgue?" She chuckled nervously, shaking her head. "Of all places, right?" The thought of someone breaking into a morgue wasn't exactly the norm, even in our small town. But if you think about it, a morgue does store various chemicals, maybe enticing to a desperate addict. Still, it was hard to picture someone going through all that effort for something like this. We drove in silence, a sense of unease filling the car as we approached the morgue, a boxy gray building looming against the night sky. Under the dim glow of streetlights, it looked like it belonged to a different time, its weathered stone exterior casting a foreboding aura. When we arrived, the custodian Robert was waiting outside. He looked pale, his eyes darting around nervously. "Thank goodness you're here," he whispered, voice barely a notch above a whimper. "I think someone's inside." "Could you tell us exactly what happened?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though I could feel my own heartbeat picking up. Robert swallowed hard. I was doing my usual rounds when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, But then, I saw someone. They ran across the hallway and vanished into one of the rooms. "Did you get a look at them?" Mia inquired, her tone gentle, but there was a tinge of urgency beneath it. He shook his head. "No. The lights were off, and I wasn't paying much attention. I know I saw someone. I didn't want to check any further alone, so I called you." Mia glanced at me, eyebrows raised. The custodian's fear was evident, and something about his trembling hands and pale complexion made me wonder if we were dealing with more than just some kid pulling a prank. "We'll check it out," I assured him. Mia muttered as we made our way inside, probably just some thrill seekers with nothing better to do. I tried to keep my thoughts light as well, but the uneasy silence of the building crept over me. As we stepped inside, a cold, musty smell hit us. The overhead lights flickered briefly before illuminating the long, narrow hallway leading into the heart of the morgue. I could hear Robert shuffling behind us, reluctant to let us out of his sight. "Police!" Mia's voice echoed as we called out. "Come out, whoever's here!" Our voices bounced off the walls, and in response, we were met only with silence. Mia and I exchanged glances and started a sweep of the building, checking room by room. The corridors were dimly lit, and every creak, every shadow made me tense. The smell of formaldehyde and other chemicals hung in the air, making the atmosphere even more unsettling. We finally entered a large waiting room. The eerie quiet made my skin crawl. We scanned the room carefully, and just as I was about to give it a final look, Mia's voice rang out down the hall. "Hey, stop right there!" she yelled, her voice urgent. I whipped around, gun raised, and dashed toward her voice. My pulse was racing. Turning the corner, I saw her staring down the corridor, gun trained on a figure at the end. It was a woman with long, dark hair. She was facing away from us, standing perfectly still. Something about her stance felt wrong, unnatural even. Mia called out, "Ma'am, show us your hands. We're here to help." Without warning, the woman bolted down the corridor and ducked around the corner. Mia and I exchanged a quick glance before racing after her. We reached the corner she had turned, only to see her disappear through a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. The door shut with a loud clang, echoing through the hallway. Robert, who had followed at a distance, stammered, "That's a dead end. That room only has one door. She can't have gone anywhere." I tried the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked tight. "Did she lock herself in?" I asked, half expecting Robert to explain how. He looked more bewildered than ever, shaking his head. "No, that door doesn't have a lock on the inside. It shouldn't be locked." My blood ran cold. "So how?" Robert produced a set of keys, his hands trembling as he unlocked the door for us. Mia and I raised our weapons and entered, our flashlights piercing through the oppressive darkness. The room was icy, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. This was where bodies were stored for temporary holding, rows of gurneys lined up neatly against the walls. On one of the gurneys, a white sheet covered a human-shaped form. The three of us stopped, the silence weighing heavily around us. Mia and I exchanged a glance, and with a deep breath, I reached for the sheet. I pulled it back, revealing the pale face of the woman we'd been chasing. Her eyes were closed, her skin ashen. A small tag on her toe read, "Julia Harper, deceased 12 days ago." My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The rational part of me insisted there had to be an explanation. Mia's hand covered her mouth, her eyes wide. This isn't possible," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Robert looked ready to faint, clutching his hands to his mouth. I told you I saw her." I stepped back, running a hand over my face. The woman, Julia Harper, had been dead for nearly 2 weeks, but we had just seen her, or something that looked like her, running through the building. As we stood there, trying to comprehend, a faint sound echoed through the room, a soft, raspy breathing that sent chills down my spine. I shined my flashlight around, but no one else was in the room. Then, something cold brushed against my neck. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I tried to steady myself, but a sensation of dread had settled in my gut, a fear I couldn't rationalize away. Mia touched my arm, her face pale. "Let's get out of here," she whispered. I didn't need convincing. As we left the morgue, I felt an overwhelming urge to keep looking over my shoulder. as if something was watching us, just out of sight. Once we were outside, Robert muttered a quick goodbye, practically sprinting toward his car. As Mia and I got back in the patrol car, she turned to me, eyes wide and unsettled. "Ethan, what just happened?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night still pressing on my chest. "I don't know, but whatever it was, I don't think we're meant to understand it." Since that night, I've returned to the morgue several times, trying to shake the feeling, to rationalize what we saw. But the image of that pale face, lying cold and still on the gurney, haunts me. Some mysteries I've come to realize are better left unsolved. Some time ago, I decided to take a road trip from Phoenix to San Francisco to visit my cousins, whom I'd grown up with and stayed close to all my life. We'd studied together in high school and stayed in touch despite the miles between us. They had both moved to Berkeley to study at the University of California, and each winter I made it a point to visit them. Setting off early in the morning, I wanted to take advantage of the time, making a few stops to see some of the scenic routes along the way. By the end of the second day, I had covered a lot of ground and planned to reach Berkeley by late evening on the third day. But as nightfall arrived, I found myself still hours away from my destination. The last gas station had been miles back, and now it was past 9 p.m., with only a few cars occasionally passing by on the darkened highway. Though the quiet road seemed peaceful at first, I could feel a familiar tinge of unease. I had always had a slight fear of deserted roads at night, and the isolation on this empty stretch made me nervous. Still, I pushed through, reminding myself that I'd be at my cousin's house soon enough. By now, fatigue had taken its toll. I felt the drowsiness setting in and knew I needed a coffee break. I finally spotted a small rest stop ahead, just off the highway. I pulled over, surprised by how deserted it looked. It was not one of those large, well-lit rest stops with multiple facilities. Instead, it was a small building with dim lighting and a handful of parking spaces. I noticed there were no other cars around, which struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the lateness of the hour. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The rest stop had a vending machine, a small restroom, and a few magazine racks by the door. I made my way inside, hoping to find a restroom and a quick caffeine fix. As I browsed the vending machine for an energy drink, I noticed a car pulling in. It came to a stop right next to mine, despite the empty spaces around us. My initial reaction was one of unease. Why would someone park so close when there were plenty of other spots? I quickly brushed it off, trying not to overthink it, and headed for the restroom, chalking it up to coincidence. I finished up in the restroom and walked out, hoping to get back on the road. But as I stepped outside, I saw the car still idling beside mine, headlights on, with a lone driver seated inside. For some reason, this made me nervous. I tried to ignore it and went back to the vending machine, deciding on a Red Bull. As I opened the can and took a sip, I couldn't help but glance back at the car parked by mine. The driver had finally shut off his engine, but he didn't step out right away. Instead, he seemed to be watching me, his figure dimly lit by the interior lights. Feeling an icy chill, I walked toward my car, intending to get back on the road as soon as possible. But just as I reached my vehicle, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening behind me. My heart raced, and I turned around, my nerves on high alert. A tall, bearded man in a brown leather jacket stepped out, his hands buried in his pockets. He looked to be in his late 40s, his piercing eyes staring right at me with an unsettling intensity. "Hey there," he called out, his voice carrying a rough edge as he walked toward me. I gave him a polite nod, trying to keep calm, even though every instinct screamed at me to get in my car and drive away. Just as we passed each other, I heard him call out again. "Hey, wait a minute," he said. I froze, and when I turned around, I found myself face to face with the barrel of a pistol aimed right at me. My pulse pounded as I struggled to steady my breath. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" he sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. I raised my hands, trying to show him I meant no harm. I felt the cold terror settle in, and I muttered, "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Just take whatever you want." He ordered me to hand over my wallet, my watch, and my phone. I did exactly as he demanded, hoping that he'd leave after taking my valuables. But instead, he jerked his head toward the dark stretch of trees lining the edge of the rest stop. "Walk," he said curtly, motioning with his gun. My heart sank. It was clear he didn't intend to just rob me. My mind raced with escape plans, but nothing seemed feasible with his gun trained on me. I pleaded with him, offering to give him my car or any money he wanted, but he only laughed in response, his eyes cold and unyielding. He led me deeper into the trees, the night cloaking us in darkness as we went farther from the road and any hope of safety. Finally, after about 20 yards, he told me to stop and turn around. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't going to make it out of there. This was the end. I stared into his merciless eyes, which were now filled with a sick satisfaction. My whole body trembled as he pointed the gun at my face and told me to kneel. As I dropped to my knees, I closed my eyes, silently praying, my mind racing with memories of my family and friends. I braced myself for the end, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. But then, something unexpected happened. A loud scream shattered the silence, followed by a distinct rustling from the brush. Startled, I opened my eyes to see the man convulsing, his face twisted in agony. He dropped the gun, clutching his leg where a rattlesnake had latched on, its fangs buried deep into his flesh. His expression shifted from smug confidence to sheer panic as he stumbled backward, releasing the pistol from his grip. I didn't waste a second. With adrenaline coursing through me, I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the gun, and bolted back toward the road, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the parking area and immediately dialed 911. It felt like hours before the flashing lights of police cars pierced the darkness. An officer approached me, guiding me to a safe spot while the others ventured into the woods, weapons drawn. I sat by my car, too shaken to speak, and waited as they combed through the trees. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers returned, their faces grim. The lead detective informed me that the man was dead by the time they found him. As it turned out, he was a wanted serial killer who had been terrorizing the highways across the region, targeting lone travelers. He had already claimed the lives of 3 people, leaving their bodies in isolated areas just like this one. It seemed that fate had intervened in a way no one could have anticipated. The officer's words settled heavily over me, and I couldn't help but feel a chilling gratitude for the twist of fate that saved my life. The venomous bite of the rattlesnake had been the very thing that stopped him, and in an ironic twist, his intended victim had escaped. As I drove away, still reeling from the encounter, I knew that night would stay with me forever. I'd come within inches of death, and the haunting image of that man's cold gaze would linger in my mind for years to come. Though I tried to shake the feeling of dread, every time I saw a dark stretch of highway, I was reminded of that close call, a strange mixture of horror and gratitude gnawing at me. To this day, I think about that night whenever I'm alone on a deserted road, and I can't help but glance over my shoulder, hoping I'll never encounter anything like that again. Officer Jake Thompson had been a state trooper for over 2 decades, navigating countless close calls and unimaginable encounters along the desolate highways of Pennsylvania. But no experience had ever shaken him to his core, quite like the events that unfolded one fog-drenched night along Route 30, near the outskirts of Lancaster. It was just past 2 a.m., a time when the highway was an eerie sight, with only the occasional distant headlights piercing through the thick, murky mist. Jake's beat ran along stretches of road that, in daylight, looked unremarkable, but by nightfall turned unsettling, as if hiding secrets only meant for the darkness. Unlike his usual solo patrols, Jake had a cameraman with him that night, Joe, who was shadowing him for the once popular TV show Highway Watch. The show's purpose was to capture the real-life experiences of officers on duty, giving viewers a glimpse of the danger and drama of police work. Jake was usually a private man, but Joe's presence, with the camera's reassuring red light blinking, didn't bother him. They had already developed an unspoken bond over their shared silence and the heavy, humid air of night patrols. Joe had his camera ready as they patrolled the outer edge of Lancaster, the heart of Pennsylvania's Amish country, but also a landscape marked by abandoned buildings and neglected businesses. This part of Lancaster County was a place where factories had once hummed with life, but were now replaced by crumbling structures and overgrown lots. Over the years, Jake had learned these deserted sites weren't as empty as they appeared. They had become hotspots for unsavory activities, drug deals, smuggling operations, and worse. As they approached a derelict gas station at the edge of town, something unusual caught Jake's eye, a flickering beam of light darting from inside the broken windows. His brows knitted in suspicion. "Strange," he muttered. "No cars around, but someone's inside." Joe raised the camera, already sensing the tension. "You want me to stay here?" he asked quietly. Jake nodded, more out of instinct than worry. "Yeah, wait here. Just keep an eye out." Jake's voice was low but firm. With one last look toward the dark building, Jake turned on his cruiser's loudspeaker. His voice boomed through the silent night, cutting through the dense fog like a blade. "This is Officer Thompson of the Pennsylvania State Police. Whoever's in there, come out with your hands up." As soon as his voice echoed through the cold night air, the flashlight went out, leaving nothing but silence. An unsettling stillness settled over the area, so thick that it felt as though the air itself had become heavier. Jake's instincts screamed at him to tread carefully, but duty compelled him to investigate. "Stay here, Joe," Jake said, giving the cameraman a nod. He pulled his flashlight from his belt, its harsh beam slicing through the thick night as he cautiously approached the gas station. The building loomed in front of him, a grim, decaying structure covered in graffiti and surrounded by overgrown weeds. As he neared the entrance, a rancid stench hit him. It was as if a small animal had died inside and been left to rot, a scent so sickly and thick that it settled in his throat, making him gag. "Anyone inside?" he called out, his voice echoing off the hollow walls. The only reply was silence, the kind that sinks into your skin and fills you with a sense of dread. The interior was pitch black, save for the faint beam from Jake's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by the sudden intrusion. Jake's flashlight swept across shelves covered in grime, empty cans, and wrappers strewn across the floor, remnants of a place long abandoned. He listened closely, straining to catch any sound, and that's when he heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from the back of the building, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Jake's pulse quickened. The sound was eerie, unnatural in the oppressive silence. "Police! Show yourself!" he shouted, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. At the far end of the building, his light caught a shadowy figure, hunched and motionless, watching him from the darkened corner. For a moment, their eyes met, or rather, he felt the weight of the figure's gaze, something dark and unreadable. Without warning, the figure bolted toward the rear exit, disappearing before Jake could process the movement. Swearing under his breath, he ran after the shadow, but as soon as he burst through the back door, he was greeted by an expanse of cornfields stretching into the black horizon. The stalks rustled softly in the breeze, their tops swaying, masking any sign of the man's escape. "Damn it," Jake muttered, scanning the cornfields, but he knew the chances of finding anyone in that thick maze were slim. The shadows seemed to swallow any movement, leaving him feeling isolated and vulnerable. Reluctantly, he turned back, his heart still racing. As he re-entered the gas station, an unsettling sense of dread gnawed at him, more intense than before. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. Moving cautiously, he shined his light into the back room, and what he found made his stomach lurch. A lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, its pale skin stretched taut, the vacant eyes staring up at the ceiling. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he knelt down to inspect the body, the scene too gruesome and surreal to fully process. Then, a heavy blow struck the back of his head. Pain shot through his skull, and his vision went dark as he collapsed to the cold, unforgiving floor. Jake awoke to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. He blinked, wincing against the blinding pain radiating from his skull. His hands felt numb, and his head throbbed with every heartbeat. It took him a moment to realize he was in a hospital, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptics and gauze. "Jake, thank God you're awake," a familiar voice murmured. His colleague, Officer Mitchell, was seated beside him, relief etched across his face. What What happened? Jake rasped, his voice hoarse, struggling to piece together fragments of the night. Mitchell shifted in his chair, glancing away as if choosing his words carefully. You were ambushed, Jake. Turns out there was a whole group of them. Joe, the cameraman, was a quick thinker. When you didn't come back, he called for backup, and we arrived just in time. Mitchell recounted how the dead body in the gas station wasn't a random victim, but a casualty of Lancaster's growing drug syndicate. The gas station had been repurposed as a dumping ground for bodies and a cover for the gang's gruesome operations. When you chased that guy outside, his accomplices must have realized you were alone inside. They seized the chance, knocked you out, and tied you up in the back room, Mitchell said, his voice thick with tension. They were planning to drag you out into the cornfields, Jake. It didn't look like they were planning to let you leave alive. Jake shuddered at the thought. The night's events played back in his mind. The flashlight, the dragging sound, the lifeless stare of the body on the floor. His heart pounded as he imagined what could have happened if backup hadn't arrived in time. Joe, he saved my life, Jake murmured, the weight of gratitude settling heavily in his chest. Mitchell nodded solemnly. Without him, they would have gotten away with it. The backup team managed to apprehend the 2 gang members who stayed behind, and we were able to round up the rest of their operation. Lancaster PD finally shut down one of the biggest drug rings in the area. Days later, Jake returned to duty, but something in him had changed. He couldn't shake the image of the gas station at night, the twisted shadows lurking just out of sight, the faint scent of decay clinging to his memories. The events haunted him, lingering in the corners of his mind. Word soon spread among the force about Jake's encounter. The gas station became known as the Midnight Trap, and the story of Officer Thompson's near-death experience was whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale that echoed through the halls of the Lancaster precinct. Even now, years later, Jake avoids Route 30 on his night shifts. The memory remains a scar, a silent reminder of how close he had come to becoming another forgotten shadow in the cornfields of Lancaster. I had just joined the California Highway Patrol, stationed in the Trinity County region, patrolling the winding stretches of Route 299. Route 299 is known for its isolated stretches, cutting through endless trees that seem to close in on you, particularly at night. I'd been on the job for only 3 months, still finding my footing. Out here, it wasn't uncommon to go hours without encountering another officer, and our coverage was mostly solo. Some people think the job of a highway patrol officer is all routine traffic stops and paperwork, but in these parts, it could feel like a whole different world, especially after dark. Working the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift was tough at first. Long nights stretched endlessly, with me in the patrol car by myself, relying on my training and instincts. When I joined the force, I'd anticipated this. I knew there'd be quiet nights, long roads, and long stretches without any action. But I'd also come to understand why these shifts were so important. On quiet nights, there was no shortage of speeders and reckless drivers trying to get a thrill out on the open road. At night, I found myself issuing ticket after ticket to late-night speedsters. But that night, things felt different. It was a Thursday, around 2 a.m., and the highway was absolutely silent. Not even a single vehicle had passed by in almost 10 minutes, which was unusual for even this lonely stretch. As I drove, I slowed down to a cautious 50 miles per hour, aware that deer and other wildlife could dart out from the forest, especially on these remote roads. The only light came from my headlights illuminating the road and a faint glow from the dashboard. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared on the shoulder of the road up ahead, just barely illuminated by my headlights. As I got closer, I realized it was a dark-colored sedan, parked awkwardly on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The driver's side door was wide open, blocking most of my lane, as if the driver had left in a hurry. I slowed down and pulled up behind the vehicle, turning on my own flashing lights to alert any approaching traffic. After radioing in to inform the dispatcher of an abandoned car on the highway, I got out to investigate, my flashlight in hand. The first thing I noticed as I approached was that the car was still running. The inside lights were on, and the keys were in the ignition. The engine's low hum echoed faintly into the surrounding forest, adding to the eerie silence that had settled over everything. I scanned the area with my flashlight, sweeping it across the woods on both sides, but there was nothing, just darkness and trees that stretched on for miles. I stepped closer and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, just the rustle of leaves and a distant hoot of an owl. A cold chill went down my spine, an instinctive feeling that something was wrong. I reached for my radio, about to call for backup, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. Near the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood watching me. It was a man, motionless, staring directly at me. He wore a strange mask, not like the simple cloth masks people had worn during the pandemic, nor a ski mask. This mask was more sinister, with hollow eye holes and a twisted expression that seemed designed to unnerve anyone who saw it. My heart pounded as I raised my flashlight toward him, trying to get a better look. The beam of light revealed not just one figure, but several more, standing just behind the first. My stomach dropped as I counted them, at least 5 men, all wearing similar masks, each one armed. Some held baseball bats, others gripped crowbars or metal rods, and one even had a shotgun slung over his shoulder. Instinct kicked in. I reached for my gun, pointing it at the group. "Drop your weapons! This is the California Highway Patrol," I shouted, my voice firm but carrying a tremor. The men remained silent, unmoving, their eyes fixed on me through their twisted masks. I took a step back, my gun still trained on them, trying to gauge their next move. They didn't flinch, didn't shift. They just stood there, watching, as though waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine as I became aware of just how isolated I was. The nearest town was miles away, and my backup was probably at least 10 minutes out. My radio crackled as I quickly called for immediate assistance, my voice tight with fear. But before I could finish my call, I heard movement from behind me, the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching and branches snapping. Another figure was approaching from the trees on the other side of the road. Now, surrounded, I felt the sheer weight of my vulnerability. I was alone, miles from any backup, with masked strangers closing in on me. My breath quickened, and I fought to keep my composure. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing my gun at the new arrival. But they didn't heed my warning. Slowly, they began to spread out, moving with an eerie, calm confidence that suggested they'd done this before. Realizing my options were running out, I began inching backward toward my cruiser, my gaze darting between the figures. My heart hammered in my chest, and I knew I had to get out of there. In one swift movement, I spun around, sprinted to my cruiser, and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the engine, my eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. As the car roared to life, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of masked figures standing at the edge of the road, lining both sides like some twisted, welcoming party. They watched me, motionless, their masked faces blank and expressionless. The sight was like something out of a nightmare, a vision that seemed too surreal to be real. I floored the gas pedal, my car speeding forward, my mind racing. As I sped down the road, I radioed my dispatcher again, this time managing to convey the urgency and fear in my voice. "This is Officer Miller, requesting immediate backup on Route 299, about 10 miles east of Trinity Center. Armed suspects in masks. Please hurry." The dispatcher's voice crackled through, calm but concerned. "Copy that, Officer Miller. Stay safe. Backup is on the way." I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those masked figures following me, but the road behind me remained empty. As I sped away, the adrenaline slowly began to wear off, replaced by a creeping feeling of dread. Who were those people? What were they doing out there, lurking in the middle of the night? When backup finally arrived, we returned to the scene together, but it was as if nothing had happened. The car was gone, leaving no trace behind. No sign of the masked figures, no disturbed branches, no footprints. It was as though they'd vanished into thin air, leaving only the tire marks on the shoulder where the abandoned sedan had been. In the following days, the story spread around the station like wildfire. Officers who'd been in the field for decades shared their own tales of strange encounters on lonely stretches of road, but nothing quite like what I'd described. For the next few weeks, the station assigned extra patrols to that section of Route 299, hoping to catch sight of the masked men or their abandoned car, but they never reappeared. I couldn't shake the experience, though. Every time I was assigned the night shift on that stretch of Route 299, I felt a knot in my stomach. The image of those blank, masked faces burned into my mind. I'd become a cop because I wanted to protect people, but out there in the woods, alone in the dark, I'd felt powerless, exposed, and deeply afraid. I still don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but I can't forget how they looked at me. Like I was just another part of the forest, something to be watched and controlled. It's been months now, and I still drive down Route 299 with a heightened sense of awareness. Sometimes, when I'm alone on the road, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, and my heart skips a beat. Part of me wonders if it's just my mind playing tricks, haunted by the memory of that night. But another part of me, the part that felt those eyes watching me from behind those masks, knows that they're still out there somewhere, hidden among the trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler.